"I speak 5 languages," the janitor's daughter said proudly. The millionaire laughed, but froze when the girl began to speak. Before we dive into the story, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. The marble floors of Henderson Tower gleamed under the crystal chandeliers as Marcus Henderson adjusted his Italian silk tie, preparing for another day of crushing business deals. At 36, he had built an empire that made grown men tremble and competitors weep. Money was his language, power his currency. "Mr. Henderson," his assistant Jessica called out, "the cleaning crew is finishing up the executive floor." Marcus barely glanced up from his phone. These people were invisible to him, just part of the machinery that kept his world spinning. But as he stepped toward the elevator, a small voice pierced through his consciousness like a bell. "Daddy, I finished my homework. Can I tell you about the new words I learned today?" Marcus turned, irritated by the disruption. A 7-year-old girl with golden curls sat cross-legged on the pristine floor, surrounded by worn textbooks. Her father, a weathered man in janitor's coveralls, was polishing the brass fixtures nearby. "Emily, sweetheart, Mr. Henderson is busy," Robert Carter whispered apologetically, but Emily's bright blue eyes locked onto Marcus with the fearless curiosity only children possess. "I speak 5 languages now," she announced proudly, her small chin lifted with determination. Marcus let out a condescending chuckle. "5 languages? That's quite impressive for a—" He paused, his eyes taking in her second-hand clothes and scuffed shoes. "For someone your age?" The mockery in his voice was unmistakable. Robert's face flushed with embarrassment as he moved toward his daughter. "Emily, come on, we need to let Mr. Henderson—" "Bonjour, Monsieur Henderson." "Je suis très heureuse de vous rencontrer," Emily said clearly, her pronunciation flawless. Marcus's smirk faltered. "French. Perfect French." "Hola, señor. Mi papá dice que usted es muy importante," she continued seamlessly in Spanish. The phone slipped slightly in Marcus's grip. "Guten Tag, sprechen Sie Deutsch?" Emily asked, tilting her head with innocent expectation. Marcus stood frozen, his mouth slightly agape. This couldn't be happening. This little girl, this janitor's daughter in her patched-up sneakers, was speaking with the fluency of someone who had spent years in Europe. But Emily wasn't finished, wasn't. "Здравствуйте," she said in perfect Russian. "Меня зовут Emily." The hallway fell into stunned silence. Jessica dropped her clipboard. Robert Carter's eyes widened in disbelief. He had never heard his daughter speak Russian before. Marcus Henderson, the man who had negotiated billion-dollar deals without blinking, found himself speechless. His carefully constructed world of assumptions had just crumbled in less than 60 seconds. "How?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Emily smiled, a mysterious glint in her young eyes. "My teacher says I'm special, but Daddy doesn't know about all my teachers yet." The words hung in the air like a puzzle waiting to be solved, and Marcus Henderson realized that this little girl held secrets that could change everything he thought he knew about intelligence, potential, and the invisible people in his tower. Marcus Henderson couldn't sleep. For the first time in 20 years, his mind wasn't calculating profits or strategizing acquisitions. Instead, he kept hearing Emily's voice, the way she effortlessly switched between languages like changing radio stations. Each word had been perfectly pronounced, each accent flawless, more refined than his own expensive European tutors had achieved. At 3 a.m., he found himself in his home office, typing into his computer. Child prodigies, multilingual children, gifted education. Each search led him deeper into a rabbit hole of articles about exceptional children, children who didn't fit into neat categories, who could absorb information at impossible rates. The penthouse felt suffocating. Marcus walked to his floor-to-ceiling windows, staring out at the city that he owned in every way that mattered. Below, the streets were empty except for the occasional taxi and a few homeless figures huddled in doorways, people as invisible to him as Robert Carter had been until yesterday. But Emily had seen him, really seen him. Not his money or his power, just him. When was the last time anyone had looked at Marcus Henderson and seen a person instead of a bank account? The next morning, Marcus arrived at Henderson Tower an hour early, his usual confidence replaced by an unfamiliar restlessness. He told himself it was to prepare for the board meeting, but his eyes kept drifting toward the service elevators, wondering if Robert would bring Emily again. "Sir?" Jessica noticed his distraction immediately. His assistant had worked for him for 8 years, reading his moods like a barometer. "Your 9 a.m. appointment with the Singapore investors is here. They flew in specifically to meet with you." Marcus stared at the conference room, where 3 men in expensive suits waited with briefcases full of contracts that would net him $50 million. Yesterday, this would have been the highlight of his week. Today, it felt meaningless. "Reschedule it," Marcus said abruptly. "I need to. Inspect the building maintenance." Jessica's perfectly manicured eyebrows shot up in disbelief. In 8 years as his assistant, Marcus had never once cared about maintenance. He signed checks for building operations, but never actually thought about the humans who kept his empire running. "Sir, these investors came from—" "I said reschedule it, Jessica. Tell them something came up. Family emergency." The lie rolled off his tongue before he could stop it. Family emergency. When had he ever put family before business? When had he ever had a family that mattered more than profits? Marcus found Robert Carter on the 15th floor, quietly replacing burned-out light bulbs in the executive conference room. The man worked with methodical precision, invisible to the executives who would rush past in a few hours, never seeing the person who kept their world bright and functional. Robert moved like a man carrying invisible weight, his shoulders slightly bowed despite his obvious strength. His janitor's uniform was clean but worn, mended in places with careful stitches. This was a man who took pride in his work, who did his job with dignity despite a world that looked right through him. "Mr. Carter," Marcus called out, his voice uncharacteristically uncertain. Robert nearly fell off his ladder. "Mr. Henderson, is there a problem with the cleaning? Did I miss something? I can—" "Your daughter," Marcus interrupted, then paused, realizing he didn't know how to continue this conversation. "Where does she go to school?" The question hung between them like a bridge. Neither man was sure they should cross. Marcus had never asked a personal question of any employee below executive level. Robert had never expected his boss to know he had a daughter, let alone care where she went to school. Robert's weathered hands tightened on the ladder rung. "Lincoln Elementary, sir. It's a good school. The teachers care about the kids, even when—" He stopped himself. "Even when what?" Robert's eyes darted away. "Even when some kids don't fit in regular classes. Emily's different, Mr. Henderson. Always has been. Too smart for her own good, her grandmother used to say." Marcus saw something flicker in the man's eyes, pride mixed with worry, love shadowed by fear. There was more to this story, layers of complexity that Marcus found himself genuinely wanting to understand. "She's remarkable," Marcus found himself saying and meant it. Robert's eyes misted over, his composure cracking. "She's everything to me, Mr. Henderson. After my wife died, Emily became my whole world. Every morning she wakes up excited about learning something new, and every night she tells me about words and languages I've never heard of. Sometimes I wonder if I'm enough for her, you know? If a man like me can raise a girl like that." The vulnerability in Robert's voice hit Marcus like a physical blow. When had anyone ever trusted him with their fears? When had he ever stood still long enough to listen? "Where is she now?" "At school, sir. She walks herself there every morning before I start work at 5. Comes home on her own too, independent as anything, that girl." "Sometimes too independent for her own good." Marcus nodded. But as Robert returned to his light bulbs, one question burned in the millionaire's mind. How does a 7-year-old learn Russian without her father knowing? And more importantly, who was teaching her? Robert Carter's apartment was a study in dignified poverty, but love filled every corner. The furniture was second-hand but spotless, each piece carefully chosen and maintained with obvious pride. The walls were bare, except for Emily's artwork. Colourful drawings of people speaking in different languages, their words floating above their heads like musical notes, and a single faded photograph of a beautiful Asian woman with Emily's piercing blue eyes. The apartment smelled like leftover soup and the vanilla candle Emily had made him for Father's Day. It was small, just 2 bedrooms, but it was clean and warm and filled with the kind of love that money couldn't buy. "Tell me about Mommy's books again," Emily said, curled up on the worn couch with a book that looked far too advanced for her age. The title was in what appeared to be German philosophy, yet she was reading it like other kids her age, read picture books. Robert's face clouded over, the same shadow that crossed his features whenever Sarah's memory surfaced. "Sweetheart, you know Mommy had to go away when you were little. She got sick and the doctors couldn't make her better." "But her books are still here," Emily pressed, pointing to a locked glass cabinet in the corner, the only expensive piece of furniture in the apartment. Inside, Robert could see dozens of leather-bound volumes, dictionaries and academic journals in languages he couldn't even identify. "Why can't I read them? I can understand some of them now." Robert followed her gaze to Sarah's library, the collection she'd spent 15 years building during her career as a linguistics professor at Columbia University. After her death, he'd locked it away, unable to bear the reminders of dreams and conversations he'd never understand again. "Those books are complicated, Em. Adult books about things like language theories and academic research." Emily's brilliant blue eyes studied her father's face with startling intensity. At 7, she could read emotions as easily as she read languages, detecting the tremor in his voice, the way his hands unconsciously clenched when he talked about her mother's work. "Daddy, are you scared of Mommy's books?" The question hit Robert like a physical blow. He was scared, terrified actually. His late wife had been fluent in 11 languages, had lectured at universities around the world, had conversations with scholars that made Robert feel like he was drowning in his own ignorance. When she died in that car accident 3 years ago, she'd left behind a library that represented a world Robert couldn't even begin to understand. But lately, Emily had been asking questions, wanting to know about words, about languages, about cultures she'd never been exposed to. And there were the voice lessons she claimed to take after school, lessons Robert had never signed her up for, never paid for. "Em, who taught you Russian yesterday, when you were talking to Mr. Henderson?" Emily's face lit up with innocent joy, the way it always did when she talked about learning. "Miss Katerina. She has the prettiest accent and tells the most wonderful stories. She says when you speak Russian, you can hear the snow falling and feel the warmth of a grandmother's kitchen." Robert's blood ran cold. He'd never heard of any Miss Katerina. Emily's school didn't offer foreign language classes, barely had funding for basic English and math. "Where do you meet Miss Katerina, sweetheart?" "At the big library downtown after school. She teaches me and 5 other kids. We sit in the special room with all the comfortable chairs." Emily's eyes sparkled with memory. "She says we're special, like flowers that need different kinds of sunshine to grow." She knew Mommy, Daddy. "She says I remind her of Mommy when she was young." Robert's hands began to shake. He'd been working double shifts to pay for Emily's schooling and their modest life, trusting that she was safe in after-school care at Lincoln Elementary. But if she was leaving school, wandering downtown to meet strangers who claimed to know Sarah, The thought made his chest tight with panic. Sarah's death had already torn his world apart once. He couldn't lose Emily too, especially not to some stranger who might have ulterior motives for befriending a gifted child. "Emily," he said carefully, fighting to keep his voice calm. "Tomorrow, Daddy's going to take time off work. We're going to walk to this library together, and I'm going to meet Miss Katerina." Emily clapped her hands excitedly. "Oh, you'll love her, Daddy. She speaks even more languages than Mommy did, and she knows stories about places where people paint with words and sing their mathematics." But Robert's mind was racing with darker possibilities. Who was this woman teaching his daughter languages he'd never heard her speak? Why did this stranger know about Sarah, and what did she want with Emily? Marcus Henderson found himself doing something unprecedented, sitting in his Bentley outside Lincoln Elementary School at 3:15 p.m., watching children pour out of the building like a river of backpacks and laughter. He told himself he was conducting due diligence on an employee's family situation, but the truth was more complicated and more unsettling. Every instinct that had made him successful in business screamed that this was a waste of time. He had 3 merger deals on his desk, 2 international conferences to prepare for, and a board of directors who were already questioning his recent strange behavior. Yet here he was, playing detective because a 7-year-old girl had spoken 5 languages and awakened something in him he'd thought was dead. He watched as Emily emerged from the school, her golden curls catching the afternoon sun like spun light. She walked with purpose, not toward the school buses or the parent pickup area, but down the sidewalk toward downtown. Marcus made a decision that surprised him. He parked his car and followed her on foot. The public library was old and worn, its marble steps cracked from decades of foot traffic, its wooden floors creaking under Marcus's expensive Italian shoes. The building smelled like old books and possibilities, reminding him of childhood afternoons when he'd hidden in libraries to escape his father's alcohol-fueled rages. Emily disappeared into the children's section, and Marcus lingered behind the periodical shelves, feeling like a complete fool. What was he doing? Corporate espionage on a second grader? "Dobro pожаловать, мои дорогие дети," came a warm voice speaking Russian. "Welcome, my dear children." Marcus peered around the corner and saw a woman in her 60s with silver hair pulled back in an elegant bun. She wore a simple sweater but carried herself with the dignity of old European nobility. She was surrounded by 6 children of various ages, all sitting in rapt attention as if she were about to reveal the secrets of the universe. Today we learn about the language of music. The woman, presumably Miss Katerina, continued in English, her accent melodic and refined. Each language has its own rhythm, its own song, its own heartbeat. "Emily, would you like to demonstrate what we learned about Italian last week?" Emily stood up confidently and began reciting what sounded like poetry, her voice rising and falling with natural rhythm. The words flowed like water, each syllable perfectly placed. Marcus didn't understand Italian, but he felt the emotion, the passion, the pure joy of expression. The other children listened, mesmerized. Marcus found himself equally entranced. "Bellissimo, mia cara," Miss Katerina said, applauding softly. "Beautiful, my dear. Now, children, remember, language is not just words on a page or sounds in the air. Language is culture, history, the soul of a people. When you speak French, you carry the dreams of Paris in your voice. When you speak Mandarin, you honor 5,000 years of wisdom and poetry." An older boy, perhaps 10, raised his hand eagerly. "Miss Katerina, my parents don't understand why I need to learn so many languages. They say English is enough for America." The woman's expression grew thoughtful, almost sad. "Ah, dear Thomas, your parents love you and want to protect you, but some minds are like special radios, capable of tuning into frequencies others cannot hear. Right now, the world speaks in anger and misunderstanding. But you children, you can be the translators, the bridge builders, the ones who help people understand each other's hearts. A younger girl piped up, "But why are we the only ones who can learn like this? Why can't other kids do what we do?" Miss Katerina knelt down to the girl's level, her eyes kind but serious. "Because, my darling ones, you were born with gifts that appear perhaps once in a generation. Your parents may not understand yet. It takes time for adults to see miracles that don't fit their expectations. But someday, the world will desperately need what you can do." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. This wasn't just an after-school language program. This woman was preparing these children for something, building them into something extraordinary. But for what purpose? As the session ended and children began packing up their books, Marcus quickly retreated to his car. But Emily's words from their first meeting echoed in his mind. "Daddy doesn't know about all my teachers yet." D. This Miss Katerina clearly knew far more about Emily's potential than Robert did. She spoke about these children as if they were weapons in some larger war, tools for bridging cultural divides that adults had created. The question burned in Marcus's mind. Should he tell Robert what he'd discovered, or was there something more dangerous at play here? Something that required his protection rather than his interference? One thing was certain. Emily Carter was not just a gifted child. She was part of something much larger, and Marcus Henderson was about to become involved whether he wanted to or not. The emergency board meeting was not going well for Marcus Henderson, and the tension in the mahogany-paneled conference room was thick enough to cut with a knife. The Henderson Foundation has always focused on profit-driven philanthropy, board member Victoria Sterling declared, her voice sharp as shattered glass. Her perfectly coiffed silver hair and $3,000 suit spoke of old money and older prejudices. "We fund cancer research because pharmaceutical returns are lucrative. We support technology education because it feeds our pipeline of skilled workers. Suddenly, you want to fund programs for gifted children? This isn't like you, Marcus." Marcus straightened his tie, feeling the weight of 12 pairs of skeptical eyes. These people had made him rich beyond imagination, but they'd also made him ruthless beyond recognition. Now, sitting here trying to explain why he wanted to spend $60 million on children they'd never met, he realized how hollow his old motivations sounded. "Sometimes the most profitable investments come in unexpected packages," Marcus said carefully. "We're talking about identifying and nurturing extraordinary talent before our competitors even know it exists." Board member James Crawford leaned forward aggressively, his thick neck straining against his collar. $60 million for educational programs? Marcus, our shareholders expect returns, not charity cases. You want to throw money at what? Some feel-good program for smart kids? There are thousands of smart kids. That doesn't make them profitable. Marcus thought of Emily's face, the way she lit up when speaking those languages, the quiet desperation he'd seen in Robert's eyes. How could he explain that intelligence like Emily's wasn't just rare, it was revolutionary? What if I told you we could identify children capable of becoming cultural ambassadors, international negotiators, people who could break down communication barriers that cost us billions in failed overseas ventures? Victoria laughed coldly, the sound echoing off the oil paintings of long-dead Henderson patriarchs. "Are you having a midlife crisis, Marcus? Because if you are, buy a sports car like everyone else. Don't gamble with company funds on your pet projects." The room erupted in nervous laughter, but Marcus felt something he'd never experienced in 20 years of business: doubt in his own ruthlessness. These people saw Emily as a line item, a potential expense. They couldn't see what he'd seen, a little girl who spoke languages like music and might hold keys to understanding that the world desperately needed. His phone buzzed urgently with a text from his head of security. "Sir, emergency at Lincoln Elementary." Employee Robert Carter's daughter hospitalized. He's requesting immediate leave. Marcus's blood turned to ice. The words on the screen seemed to swim before his eyes. Emily, hospital. The room suddenly felt airless. Meeting adjourned, he announced, standing abruptly and heading for the door. Marcus, we haven't voted on the foundation funding, Victoria protested. I said adjourned. We'll revisit this when I return. Where are you going? Crawford demanded. Marcus paused at the door, his hand on the brass handle. To remember what's actually important. 20 minutes later, Marcus burst through the sliding doors of St. Mary's Hospital, his heart pounding with an anxiety he hadn't felt since his own childhood. The antiseptic smell and fluorescent lighting brought back memories of visiting his mother during her final illness, memories he'd spent decades burying under ambition and success. He found Robert in the pediatric waiting room, his head in his hands, still wearing his janitor's uniform. The man looked smaller somehow, diminished by fear and helplessness. What happened? Marcus demanded, sitting down beside Robert without caring about the shocked stares from other families. The most powerful man in the city was sitting in a public hospital waiting room next to a janitor, and he didn't care who saw him or what they thought. Robert looked up, his eyes red with unshed tears. Mr. Henderson, how did you know we were here? Just tell me what happened to Emily. She collapsed at school during math class, Robert whispered, his voice breaking. 1 minute she was helping other kids with their homework, speaking to them in perfect French, which I still don't understand. And the next minute she was on the floor, shaking. The school called an ambulance. His hands trembled as he spoke. The doctors are running tests, but they don't know what caused it. They keep asking about her medical history, about her mother's family, about things I can't answer because Sarah never told me everything about her research. Marcus sat down beside Robert, ignoring protocol and professional distance. She's going to be okay. Robert looked at him with desperate hope. How can you know that? The doctors said they've never seen brain activity like hers. They're talking about seizures, about overstimulation, about things that could mean... He couldn't finish the sentence. Because, Marcus said quietly, surprising himself with the conviction in his voice, extraordinary people don't break easily. They just need the right kind of help. For the first time since his own childhood, Marcus Henderson found himself praying to a God he'd forgotten he believed in. And in that sterile waiting room, surrounded by other parents facing their own fears, he realized that everything he'd built his life around, money, power, success, meant nothing if he couldn't protect one small girl who had reminded him what it felt like to be human. Dr. Elena Vasquez had seen many unusual cases in her 30 years of pediatric neurology, from children with extraordinary mathematical abilities to kids who could remember everything they'd ever read. But Emily Carter's brain scans were unlike anything in medical literature, and they terrified her. The language centers in her brain are unprecedented, Dr. Vasquez explained to Robert and Marcus as they huddled around her computer screen in the small consultation room. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows on their worried faces. Most people use primarily the left hemisphere for language processing, with some right brain involvement for context and emotion. Emily is using both hemispheres simultaneously, plus regions we typically associate with music, mathematics, and spatial reasoning. She clicked through the brain scans, each image more astounding than the last. It's as if her brain has rewired itself to process language as a multidimensional experience, rather than simple word recognition. When she hears French, she's not just understanding vocabulary, she's processing cultural context, historical references, emotional nuances, all simultaneously. Robert leaned forward, his knuckles white, as he gripped the arms of his chair. Is that why she collapsed? Is she going to be okay? I believe Emily's brain is processing information at a rate that occasionally overwhelms her nervous system, Dr. Vasquez continued carefully. It's like having a supercomputer running on a 7-year-old's power grid. The seizure was her brain's way of protecting itself from sensory overload. Marcus studied the brain scans with the same intensity he brought to financial reports. Is there treatment, some way to help her manage this? Dr. Vasquez hesitated, choosing her words carefully. This isn't a disease, Mr. Henderson. This is evolution. I've only seen patterns like this once before, in a research paper I came across during my residency. It was published by a linguistics professor at Columbia University about accelerated language acquisition in children. Robert's face went pale as parchment. Columbia? Yes, a doctor. Sarah Chen published groundbreaking research on genetic markers that could produce extraordinary linguistic abilities. She theorized that certain children might be born with enhanced neural connectivity, making them natural polyglots and cultural interpreters. Dr. Vasquez paused, studying her patient chart. Mr. Carter, what was Emily's mother's maiden name? Chen, Robert whispered, his voice barely audible. Sarah Chen. The silence in the room was deafening. Outside, the sounds of the hospital continued, phones ringing, pages being announced, the steady beep of monitors. But inside the consultation room, 3 adults stared at each other as the pieces of a complex puzzle began falling into place. Dr. Vasquez's eyes widened as she pulled up files on her computer. Mr. Carter, your wife was conducting classified research for the Department of Education on gifted children. Her work suggested that there might be others, children with extraordinary abilities appearing in families across the country, part of some kind of genetic emergence. Marcus felt his pulse quicken. Miss Katarina, he said suddenly. Who? Doctor. Vasquez asked sharply. There's a Russian woman teaching Emily and other children after school. She seems to know about Emily's abilities, knows exactly how to nurture them. She mentioned that Emily reminded her of her mother. Dr. Vasquez grabbed Robert's arm urgently, her professional composure cracking. Mr. Carter, your wife's research notes mention a Russian colleague, Dr. Katerina Volkov, a former Soviet linguist who defected to America in the 1990s. If she's working with your daughter. What? Robert demanded, his voice rising with panic. What about Sarah's research? What happened to it? Doctor. Vasquez looked between them gravely, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. According to these classified files, your wife believed these children weren't just gifted. She thought they might be humanity's next evolutionary step. Natural translators and cultural ambassadors who could bridge communication gaps between nations. The research was being funded by multiple government agencies until what? Marcus pressed. Until Dr. Chen died in what was reported as a car accident. Dr. Vasquez's words hung in the air like a death sentence. The research was immediately classified and sealed. If Dr. Volkov is here, working with Emily and other children like her. What are you saying? Robert's voice cracked with fear. Dr. Vasquez stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the city skyline. Mr. Carter, your daughter isn't just a gifted child. She might be part of something much larger and much more dangerous than any of us realized. If there are people who want to use these children, or people who want to stop them from developing their abilities. Through the hospital room window, Emily lay sleeping in the pediatric ICU, her small face peaceful despite the electrodes monitoring her extraordinary brain. Machines beeped steadily, tracking the neural activity that even doctors couldn't fully understand. Marcus Henderson stared at the sleeping child and realized that everything he thought he knew about his ordered world was about to change forever. Emily Carter wasn't just a remarkable little girl. She was possibly the key to humanity's future, or its greatest vulnerability. and somehow a billionaire businessman and a working-class janitor had become her unlikely protectors in a game whose rules they were only beginning to understand. The next morning, Marcus Henderson did something that would have been unthinkable a week ago. He called in sick. For the first time in 20 years, he chose someone else's needs over his empire. Robert had taken unpaid leave to stay with Emily, and Marcus couldn't bear the thought of the man facing this alone. They met outside the downtown library at 2 p.m., both looking like they hadn't slept. Robert's janitor uniform was wrinkled, his eyes hollow with worry. Marcus had traded his usual $1,000 suits for jeans and a sweater, trying to blend in, though his Rolex and perfectly styled hair still screamed wealth. "Are you sure about this?" Robert asked nervously. "What if she's dangerous? What if we're putting Emily in more risk?" Marcus thought about Emily's peaceful face in that hospital bed, connected to machines monitoring brain activity that defied medical explanation. "We're already in risk, Robert. The question is whether we face it blindly or with information." Inside the library, they found Miss Katerina in the same comfortable reading nook, but this time she was alone, reading a thick book written in what appeared to be Russian Cyrillic script. She looked up as they approached, and Marcus was struck by the sadness in her eyes, as if she'd been expecting this confrontation and dreading it. "Mr. Carter," she said softly, closing her book. "And you must be Mr. Henderson. Emily told me about the interesting man who speaks with numbers instead of words." "Who are you?" Robert demanded, his protective instincts overriding his natural politeness. "What do you want with my daughter?" Katerina gestured to the chairs across from her. "Please, sit. There is much you need to understand and little time to explain it." Marcus remained standing, using his height to intimidate. "We know about Sarah's research. We know Emily isn't the only child you're working with. What we don't know is why, or what you're really preparing these kids for." Katerina's composure cracked slightly. "You know about Sarah's work? How much do you know?" "Enough to know that her death might not have been an accident," Robert said, his voice shaking. "Enough to know that Emily's abilities are connected to something larger. Something that got my wife killed." For a long moment, Katerina studied both men, as if weighing whether they could handle the truth. Finally, she opened her book and pulled out a photograph. Sarah Chen, but younger, standing next to Katerina in what looked like a university setting. "Your wife was my closest friend and colleague," Katerina said quietly. "We worked together for 15 years, first in Russia, then here in America. Sarah wasn't just studying gifted children, she was one herself, and so am I." Marcus felt the ground shift beneath his feet. "You're saying you have the same abilities as Emily?" "Emily's abilities make mine look like a parlor trick," Katerina replied. "But yes, I can process and speak 17 languages fluently. Understand cultural nuances that take others years to learn. Sarah could do 19. We found each other in graduate school, two anomalies in a world that didn't understand what we were." Robert leaned forward desperately. "Then why didn't she tell me? Why all the secrets?" Katerina's eyes filled with tears. "Because the government found us, Mr. Carter. They wanted to study us, weaponize us, turn our gifts into tools for intelligence gathering and cultural manipulation. Sarah agreed to help identify other children like us, thinking she could protect them. But when she realized what they really wanted—" "What did they want?" Marcus asked, though he was beginning to guess. "They wanted to create a generation of perfect spies, cultural infiltrators, people who could blend into any society and extract information or influence political outcomes. They called it Project Babel, the reverse of the biblical story. Instead of scattering languages to create confusion, they wanted to use language mastery to create control." The weight of this revelation settled over the three adults like a shroud. Emily wasn't just gifted, she was potentially a weapon in a war she didn't even know existed. Sarah threatened to expose the project, Katerina continued. She had documented evidence of children being taken from their families, of experiments that went too far. The car accident happened 3 days before she was supposed to testify before Congress. Robert's face went white with rage and grief. They killed her. They killed my wife to keep their secret. "Lo, I've been hiding for 3 years," Katerina whispered, "teaching children like Emily in secret, trying to help them develop their gifts safely while staying off the government's radar. But now that Emily's abilities are manifesting so strongly, they'll come for her," Marcus finished, his business mind immediately grasping the implications. Katerina nodded gravely. "Mr. Henderson, your resources, combined with Mr. Carter's love for his daughter and my knowledge of what we're facing, together we might be able to protect Emily and the other children. Apart, we don't stand a chance." Outside the library windows, Marcus noticed a black sedan that had been parked across the street when they arrived. It was still there, and he was almost certain he'd seen the same car near the hospital yesterday. "I think," Marcus said quietly, "we may already be out of time." The black sedan followed them for 6 blocks before Marcus was certain they were being watched. His driver, training from years of corporate security briefings, kicked in. Vary your speed, make unexpected turns, watch for pattern confirmation. All the indicators were there. "Robert," Marcus said calmly, checking his rearview mirror, "we're being followed." Robert twisted in the passenger seat, his face pale. "Are you sure? Maybe it's just 2 cars, Marcus corrected, spotting a second vehicle that had picked up their tail. "Professional surveillance. They want us to know they're there." Marcus's phone rang, displaying an unknown number. He answered on speaker. "Mr. Henderson," came a crisp, authoritative voice. "Agent Patricia Williams, Department of Homeland Security. We need to have a conversation." "About what?" Marcus replied, though he already knew. "About a 7-year-old girl who poses a significant national security concern, and the Russian operative who's been training her." Robert exploded. "National security concern? She's a child. She's my child." "Mr. Carter, we understand your parental instincts, but Emily's abilities make her extremely valuable to foreign intelligence services. We have evidence that Katerina Volkov has been systematically identifying and recruiting gifted children for purposes we're still investigating." Marcus pulled into a parking garage trying to buy time. "What evidence?" "Katerina Volkov is a former Soviet intelligence officer who entered this country under false pretenses. Her supposed academic credentials were fabricated. She's been operating a cell of extraordinarily gifted children, and we have reason to believe she's preparing them for activation." The words hit Robert like physical blows. "No, no, she knew Sarah. She showed us pictures. Doctored images, Mr. Carter. Miss Volkov is extremely sophisticated. She's been playing a long game, and your daughter is the prize." Marcus's business instinct screamed that something was wrong with this narrative. "If you're so concerned about Emily's safety, why haven't you moved earlier? She's been meeting with Katerina for months." "Because we were building a case." Now that Emily's abilities have reached a critical threshold, as evidenced by yesterday's incident, the threat level has escalated. We need to bring her in for protective evaluation." "Bring her in where?" Robert demanded. "A secure facility designed for children with special abilities. She'll receive the best care, the best education, and most importantly, protection from foreign agents who would exploit her gifts." Marcus thought about Emily lying in that hospital bed, about the fear in Robert's eyes, about Katerina's tears when she spoke about Sarah. Either Katerina was a master manipulator who had fooled them all, or the government agents were the real threat to Emily's safety. "We'll need to see credentials," Marcus said, "and we'll need legal representation present. Agent Williams's voice hardened. "Mr. Henderson, this isn't a negotiation. We have legal authority under the Patriot Act to detain individuals who pose national security risks. Emily Carter falls under that classification." "She's 7 years old," Robert shouted. "She's a potential asset in the wrong hands, Mr. Carter. We're trying to ensure she stays in the right hands." Marcus made a decision that surprised him with its swiftness. "We're going to the hospital to check on Emily. You're welcome to follow us there, but any further conversation happens through lawyers." He hung up and immediately dialed his personal attorney, then his head of security. Whatever was happening, Emily needed protection from someone, either from foreign agents or from her own government. Marcus was beginning to suspect it might be both. At St. Mary's Hospital, they found Emily awake for the first time since her collapse. She was sitting up in bed, speaking quietly in what sounded like perfect Mandarin to a surprised nurse. "Daddy!" she called out when she saw Robert. "I dreamed in colors last night. All the languages had different colors, and I could paint with them." Dr. Vasquez approached them with a mixture of excitement and concern. "Emily's brain activity has stabilized, but it's unlike anything we've ever recorded. She's been speaking to staff members in languages she's never formally studied: Mandarin, Arabic, even what appears to be an obscure Celtic dialect." "How is that possible?" Robert asked. "We think her brain has learned to extrapolate linguistic patterns from minimal exposure. She heard a few words of Mandarin from a Chinese intern yesterday, and now she's functionally conversational." Marcus stared at Emily, who was now drawing pictures of people speaking in rainbow-colored words. She wasn't just gifted, she was a miracle of human evolution, and people wanted to control her, study her, use her. "Emily," Marcus said gently, "do you remember Miss Katerina telling you about staying safe?" Emily's eyes grew serious beyond her years. "She said there might be people who want to use my voice for singing sad songs instead of happy ones. She taught us the special game for when the scary people come." "What special game?" Robert asked. Emily looked around the room carefully, then whispered, "The invisible game, when you hide not just your body, but your words too. Miss Katerina said it's the most important game we might ever play." Through the hospital room window, Marcus could see 2 more black sedans pulling into the parking lot. Time was running out, and he still didn't know who to trust. But looking at Emily's innocent face, he knew one thing for certain. He would do whatever it took to keep her safe, even if it meant going to war with his own government. The service tunnels beneath St. Mary's Hospital smelled like disinfectant and decades of forgotten maintenance. Marcus had never imagined he'd be crawling through them in a $1,000 sweater, following Robert Carter's surprisingly expert knowledge of building infrastructure. 20 years of maintenance work teaches you things, Robert explained quietly as they navigated the narrow passages. Every building has secrets, ways to move around that the architects never put on official blueprints. Emily rode piggyback on her father's shoulders, surprisingly calm for a 7-year-old in the middle of what was essentially a kidnapping from federal agents. She had wrapped herself in a hospital blanket covered with cartoon bears and was whispering something that sounded like Latin prayers. "Where did she learn Latin?" Marcus asked, trying to distract himself from the claustrophobic walls. "I didn't even know she had learned Latin," Robert replied. Sweetheart, what are you saying?" Miss Katerina taught us protection words," Emily whispered back. "She said every language has magic in it if you know how to listen. Latin is good for when you're scared, because it's been protecting people for thousands of years." They emerged in the basement parking garage of a building 3 blocks away, where Marcus's head of security, David Chen, no relation to Sarah, was waiting with an unmarked van. "Sir, we have a problem," David reported grimly. "Those federal agents, they're not in any database I can access." Either they're so classified that even my contacts can't verify them, or they're not who they say they are. Marcus felt his blood chill. What are you saying? I'm saying I've worked government security for 15 years, and something about this whole operation smells wrong. Real DHS agents don't corner civilians in parking garages. They don't threaten children, and they sure don't operate without proper paperwork. Robert clutched Emily tighter. Then who are they? That's what we need to find out, but first, we need to get you somewhere safe. David drove them through the winding roads of upstate New York for 2 hours before pulling into what looked like an abandoned summer camp. The cabins were weathered but structurally sound, surrounded by dense woods that would make surveillance difficult. Corporate retreat property, David explained. Off the books, purchased through shell companies. Mr. Henderson uses it for sensitive negotiations. Inside the main cabin, Marcus was surprised to find it well stocked with supplies and communication equipment. His paranoid business practices were finally proving useful for something other than corporate espionage. Emily immediately gravitated toward a wall map of the world, her finger tracing countries and continents with the precision of someone who understood geography intuitively. "Daddy, look," she said excitedly. "I can hear all the places where people speak the languages I know. It's like the world is singing to me in different voices." She began pointing to regions and speaking in the corresponding languages: Arabic for the Middle East, Portuguese for Brazil, Hindi for India. But then she paused at Eastern Europe and frowned. "There's something wrong here," she said quietly. "The voices are scared. Someone is hurting the singing." Robert knelt beside his daughter. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" "In the place where Miss Katerina's first language comes from, the words are crying. People are. People are being taken away for knowing too much." Marcus exchanged a glance with Robert. Emily's abilities were evolving beyond simple language comprehension. She seemed to be picking up on cultural emotions, political tensions, perhaps even current events from news reports she'd overheard in languages most people couldn't understand. "Emily," Marcus said gently, "when Miss Katerina taught you the invisible game, did she teach other children too?" Emily nodded solemnly. 6 others. Thomas, who speaks like a computer, Maria, who can sing in languages she's never heard, little Kevin, who draws words instead of pictures. "We're all special radio receivers," Miss Katerina says. "But now the bad people know about us." "How do you know they know?" Robert asked. Emily's young face grew troubled. "Because this morning, when I was dreaming in colors, I heard Thomas crying in German, and Maria was singing a scared song in Spanish. They're taking us, Daddy, one by one." The implications hit Marcus like a freight train. If Emily was right, if she was somehow connected to the other gifted children, then this wasn't just about her. There was a systematic operation targeting all of Katerina's students. "We need to find Katerina," Marcus said grimly. "She's the only one who understands what we're really facing." But even as he said it, he wondered if they were already too late. Outside the cabin windows, the forest was beautiful and peaceful, but Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that they were living in the calm before a much larger storm. Emily curled up on the couch next to her father, and for the first time since this nightmare began, she looked like what she was: a small, frightened child who had been thrust into a world of adult dangers and conspiracies. "Daddy," she whispered, "I don't want to be special anymore. I just want to go home." Robert kissed the top of her head, and Marcus saw tears in the man's eyes. "I know, sweetheart. Daddy's going to figure out how to make this all okay." But as night fell over the hidden cabin, Marcus wondered if any of them would ever be okay again. The knock on the cabin door at 3 a.m. sent everyone scrambling for the emergency protocols David had established. Marcus grabbed the satellite phone while Robert moved Emily to the reinforced back room. But the voice calling from outside stopped them all cold. "It's Katerina, please, I'm alone and we don't have much time." David checked the perimeter with night vision before cautiously opening the door. Katerina stumbled inside, her elegant composure completely shattered. Her silver hair was disheveled, her clothes torn, and her hands were shaking. "They took the children," she gasped. "All of them. Thomas, Maria, Kevin, they're gone." Robert emerged from the back room, his face deadly pale. "Who took them?" "The same people who killed your wife," Katerina said, accepting the cup of water David offered with trembling hands. "But it's not who you think. It's not the government." Marcus leaned forward intently. "Then who?" Katerina looked up at them with eyes full of tears and terror. "It's me. It's all been me." The silence in the cabin was deafening. Emily appeared in the doorway, studying Katerina with an expression far too mature for her 7 years. "You're different," Emily said quietly. "Your words taste different now. They taste like goodbye." Katerina began to sob. "My darling Emily, I'm so sorry. I never wanted to hurt any of you, but they have my grandson. They've had him for 4 years, and they said they'd kill him if I didn't deliver the children." Robert stood up so quickly his chair fell over. "What are you talking about? My real name is Katerina Petrov. I was a linguistics professor in Moscow until my daughter and her husband were killed in what looked like an accident. My grandson Alexei survived, but he was taken by people who knew about our family's gifts. They said if I helped them identify and cultivate other gifted children in America, they'd let Alexei live." Marcus felt the world tilt on its axis. "So everything you told us about Project Babel was true, but incomplete. There are multiple groups trying to control children like Emily. The American government wants them for intelligence operations. But there are private interests, international cartels, people who see these children as commodities to be bought and sold. And Sarah?" Robert's voice was barely a whisper. Katerina's composure broke completely. "Sarah found out. She discovered that I was reporting on her research, feeding information about Emily's development to my handlers. She confronted me the day before she died, said she was going to expose everything. I begged her to run, to take Emily and disappear, but she said she couldn't let other children suffer." Robert lunged toward Katerina, but Marcus caught his arm. "Let her finish. The car accident was meant for me," Katerina continued through her tears. "Sarah was driving my car. I had lent it to her because hers was in the shop. They killed her thinking they were killing me." The truth hung in the air like poison. Sarah Chen had died because she'd tried to protect children like Emily. Katerina had been forced into betraying the children she loved to save her own grandchild. And now all of them were caught in a web of competing interests that saw gifted children as weapons rather than people. "Where is Emily supposed to be delivered?" Marcus asked, his business mind cutting through the emotion to focus on actionable intelligence. "Tomorrow night, a private airfield outside Albany. They're planning to transport all the children to a facility in Eastern Europe where their abilities can be enhanced." Emily stepped forward, and when she spoke, her voice carried an authority that silenced all the adults. "Miss Katerina, are you going to give me to the bad people to save your grandson?" Katerina looked at this remarkable child who spoke like someone with decades of life experience. "No, my darling, that was the plan. But I can't do it. I won't sacrifice you and the others, even for Alexei. Some things are more important than survival." Emily nodded solemnly. "Daddy, Mr. Marcus, Miss Katerina, I have an idea. But you're going to have to trust me to do something very dangerous." Robert immediately shook his head. "Absolutely not. You're 7 years old. This isn't—" "Daddy," Emily interrupted gently. "I can hear them. The other children. They're scared, but they're still connected to me somehow, and I think I know how to help them." Marcus studied Emily's face, seeing intelligence that defied her age. What kind of dangerous? Emily smiled, and for a moment she looked like the child she should have been allowed to remain. The kind where the hunters become the hunted, and the special radio receivers become the ones sending the messages. Outside the cabin, dawn was beginning to break over the mountains. In 18 hours, a group of extraordinarily gifted children was scheduled to disappear forever into a nightmare of exploitation and control. But as Emily began explaining her plan, Marcus realized that the people who had underestimated these children, who saw them as passive assets to be collected and used, were about to learn a very dangerous lesson about the power of young minds that could think in ways no adult could anticipate. The abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Albany looked exactly like what it was, a front for illegal operations. As Marcus surveyed the building through high-powered binoculars from their concealment in the tree line, he counted at least 12 armed guards and 3 black SUVs. "Private security," David confirmed through his earpiece. "Military-grade equipment, coordinated movements. These aren't federal agents, they're mercenaries." Beside Marcus, Robert checked his own equipment with the methodical precision of someone who had worked with tools his entire life. The janitor had transformed into a protective father, willing to do anything for his child, and Marcus found himself impressed by the man's quiet competence. "Are you certain Emily can do what she's promising?" Robert asked for the 5th time. Marcus looked back at the girl who was sitting cross-legged 50 yards away, her eyes closed, in deep concentration. She had been in this meditative state for 2 hours, claiming she was talking to the others and preparing for what she called the big conversation. "Honestly, I have no idea," Marcus admitted. "But I've spent 20 years betting on people's abilities, and Emily is the smartest person I've ever met, regardless of her age." Katerina approached them, her face drawn with exhaustion and guilt. "The children are being held in the main building's basement level. Alexei would be with them. He's 12 now, with abilities even stronger than Emily's, if we can reach them." "When?" Marcus corrected. "When we reach them." At exactly 8 p.m., Emily opened her eyes and walked over to the adults. Her expression was serene but determined, like someone who had made a difficult decision and found peace with it. "They're ready," she announced. "Thomas is scared, but he's the strongest with computers and electronic things. Maria can make people feel emotions when she sings. Kevin can make people see things that aren't there with his drawings. And Alexei," she smiled. "Alexei is angry, and when he gets angry, he can make people understand exactly what he's feeling, just by talking to them." "What's the plan, Em?" Robert asked, kneeling to his daughter's level. "You and Mr. Marcus are going to walk up to the front door and demand to see me. They'll think you're trying to negotiate or surrender. But really, you're going to be the distraction while Miss Katerina goes in through the service entrance she knows about." Marcus frowned. "That puts you in the middle of a very dangerous situation." "I'm already in the middle of it," Emily replied with startling maturity. "But now I'm going to be in the middle of it on purpose, with help." She held up a small radio device that David had modified. "When I press this button, it will send a signal that all the children will hear through the building's intercom system. And then we're going to do something that no adult would ever think of." "What?" Katerina asked. Emily's smile was both innocent and cunning. "We're going to tell the truth, all of it, at the same time, in every language we know." The plan was simple in concept and terrifying in execution. Emily would surrender herself, allowing the mercenaries to bring her into the facility. Once inside, she would activate the signal that would coordinate all 6 children in a simultaneous revelation, broadcasting their story, the truth about the kidnapping, and a plea for help in multiple languages through every communication device in the building. "The guards won't understand most of what we're saying," Emily explained, "but the languages we know aren't just spoken by children. Adults all over the world speak them too, and if we broadcast through their own equipment. Marcus understood immediately. You'll reach local authorities, federal agencies, international contacts. Anyone monitoring communications in the area will hear testimonies in their native languages. Plus, Emily added with a mischievous glint in her eyes, Kevin's going to make all the security cameras show things that aren't really there. Thomas is going to make their computers do very unfriendly things, and when Maria starts singing... She didn't need to finish. Marcus had seen the emotional impact these children could have on adults. If Maria could project fear or sadness or anger through her voice, the guards wouldn't be able to think clearly. "And Alexei?" Robert asked. Emily's expression grew serious. "Alexei is going to make them understand, really understand, what it feels like to be taken away from your family and used by people who don't care if you live or die." As they prepared to implement the most audacious rescue plan Marcus had ever heard of, he realized that Emily wasn't just brilliant. She was a natural strategist who understood human psychology at a level that should have been impossible for someone her age. But then again, everything about these children defied what should have been possible. "Remember," Emily said as they prepared to move, "I'm not really 7 years old anymore. None of us are the ages our bodies say we are. Our minds have been growing faster than our bodies, and today, we stop pretending to be normal children." As they approached the warehouse, Marcus found himself praying to whatever cosmic force had created minds like Emily's, hoping that intelligence and courage would be enough to overcome the adults who had tried to turn gifts into weapons. The rescue was about to begin, and Marcus Henderson realized that he was no longer trying to save Emily Carter. He was following her into battle.